Hey everyone, today I present to you, What if Ichigo Kurosaki was in God of War, Part 1. Feel free to like, subscribe, and comment. I'm sure you all have heard of the Titanomachy, the Great War, the war between the gods and the Titans. The war itself was spectacular, showing that the gods were the beings that could utterly defeat the Titans, clearly the most powerful in this world, next to that of the Sisters of Fate. Beings that none could fight, let alone beat or survive. But there was a story that was lost in time, so old that all but a few forgot. A story of a being that was even more powerful than the Titans, and possibly, the gods. Not only was this being powerful, but old, too old, older than the Titans, older than even the Sisters of Fate. The fact that this being was here before than even them is more than enough to terrify them, since they do not hold his thread. There was none for them to collect, just there, a being that they do not know. That they cannot stop. The being though, cannot go to the Sisters of Fate, for he cannot change his fate without his thread. Before the time of the gods, there was a feud between three titans, Koius, Atlas, and Astraeus, upon who of the three were stronger, and on the verge of a devastating battle. Two other titans, Eos, and Leto, tried to stop the possible fight, but could not hold off the other titans, and could only wait for Gaia to arrive and break the fight. While the conflict began to escalate, a figure appeared, the size of a typical human, wearing a cloak that covered his entire figure and half his face, the one Ichigo has when he saves Rukia from the execution, and an odd, cone-shaped hat made of straw. He also seemed to have a very large sword, covered in bandages, on his back. He walked upon the group, as though that he was walking towards a group of bickering children. Atlas caught the figure walking towards them and warned, "Turn back, mortal, I do not wish for you to be harmed." Although a great being, he cared to not harm those who were not involved. The others noticed the being's appearance as it merely stood there, looking at them, its face in a shadow. Koius, arrogant of his power and his superiority over the mortals, then threatened, "You should listen, mortal, this no such place for a creature like you to even be in our presence," his voice booming, shaking the very ground with its strength. The being, in annoyance, yelled out, "I came here to tell you all to shut the hell up. You all fighting is getting on my goddamned nerves," its voice echoing throughout the silence the great giants held, shocked that such an inferior being addressed them in such a way. "Why, you insolent whelp! I could crush you without even an effort," Koius roared, anger driving every fiber of his being. The being scoffed, "Hey, I like to see you try," it yelled out, as if mockingly, taking of the weapon on his back, and stabbing it into the ground. Koius, not being able to take the mortal's insults, lifted his hand into the air, and bringing it over the being. He grasped the being in his fist, crushing the ground below. He brought his fist the front of his face, looking down at the being who had his arms to his body, in the grasp of the Titan, only leaving his head and shoulders visible, still wearing the odd straw hat. Koius then began to growl as he tightened his grip, supposedly crushing the mortal. To his great surprise, the being was somehow resisting his grip. The figure's head rose, allowing Koius to see under the hat, only to see a great grin. The being then seemed to disappear from his grasp, only to reappear in an instant later, right in front of his face, with its leg cocked back. The being unleashed a devastating kick to the Titan's cheek, lifting him off the ground and fly off and skip on the ground a few times, before rolling to a stop, a few miles from where the group was, seemingly unconscious. Atlas, shocked to see such a thing, to even know such a thing has just happened, looked to the being, as he fell from the air, and land on the ground, far too high for any mortal to survive, unfazed. He realized this thing just harmed one of his own, so he took action. He rushed the being from his left, raised one of his forearms, and slammed a fist with all of his strength onto the being. Atlas felt nothing but the ground buckle and shatter as his fist met the ground. Dust was kicked up and obscured his view of what the outcome of the attack was. But he was pretty sure that the being was killed with the attack, being one of the titans with great physical strength. There was no way that the being could survive such a thing. That was when he felt a sudden pressure on one of his knuckles. He then was lifted off of the ground, swung over where his fist was, and slammed, head first, into the ground, before being lifted again, and thrown over the group of now 3 titans. He landed hard, and was also knocked out cold. The 3 remaining titans looked to each other, then to the being, who stood there, in the middle of the crater that Atlas created with his attack, unharmed. They looked back to each other, and decided. The titans may have their differences, but they were all still family, and seeing the other 2 titans in their current status, they simply could not stand for that. So they charged. XXXXXXXX. Gaia made her way to where the group of titans were. The fight would inevitably start. As she rounded the mountain, shock filled her form at the sight before her. 3 titans were lying prone, still, around a very large crater, with the sight of 2 other titans in the distance. She was wondering what happened, how that all 5 titans were unconscious and not one awake. That is when she saw him. He was standing in the middle of the crater, reaching out to grab what looked like a very large sword out of the ground, and placed it upon his back. She could not see what he looked like, because he was wearing a large cloak and some odd hat of sorts. The being then turned to her. She was worried for her children, and prepared to rush at the supposed assailant. That is before he seemed to disappear from sight, confusing her, until she heard a voice from her shoulder. "It's okay, Gaia. I did not harm them too much, just knocked them out cold. Don't really like killing either way." The last part was muttered. Gaia noticed though, that his voice was filled with kindness. She calmed a bit, but still on edge, since he did defeat the 5 titans in front of her. "Why did you do this to them?" she asked, turning her head to look to her shoulder, seeing the figure there with his arms crossed. "Because their bickering was getting on my frigging nerves," the figure responded, turning his head to the bodies that laid. His voice was filled with annoyance, but took note of a hint of amusement. She looked at the figure with a curious look. He decided to get into a fight with titans over them annoying him? She couldn't believe it. "Who are you?" she asked, wanting to know who this strange warrior was, if his carrying a weapon and skill determined anything. She was beginning to grow a little more comfortable with the figure on her shoulder, knowing that he would not decide to attack her out of the blue. She was known to be the kindest of all the titans, holding a somewhat motherly attitude towards all things, whether titan or mortal, since she was the titan of the planet and housed all that lived. The figure looked at Gaia with a something akin to shock, before turning away, looking slightly down. Gaia thought that she made a mistake, asking for his name, before she heard him reply with a short laugh, "Hey, the name's Ichigo." Gaia noticed that his voice was filled with what she would consider joy. She wondered why? She didn't get a chance to ask. "I'm happy we met," he stated in a friendly voice. She noticed that it was pretty mature, but had a slight scratchiness to it, as though he was still an adolescent. "It's been far too long since someone asked my name." As she stared at the now, she dubbed, strange man, the figure raised his head to look off into the sky, giving her a glimpse of the smile that he was giving off. His skin was fairly tan, but not overly so, and that his skin looked that of a teen, or, if she remembered correctly, early adult. He seemed young. The figure turned his back to the Titan, putting his hands up and behind his head, under the wide-brimmed, straw hat that he had no intention of ever taking off. "Guess I'll see you some other time, eh?" he sounded off, waving a hand over his head with only a couple of fingers present, before disappearing one last time to appear on the ground to her left. He looked in either direction and, to Gaia's guess, shrugged, and picked a random direction and started walking. She watched, bemused, before letting the strange being walk off, before turning towards the other titans who were still lying on the ground. As she walked towards the nearest one, she noticed he was awake, and seemed to be staring off into space. It was Atlas. "An interesting being he is," Atlas stated, before looking to Gaia with a stoic look. "I woke up after the fight, and he was just standing there, looking me in the eye, and asked if I was okay." Gaia found this interesting, but not to her surprise, as it seemed to be expected for some odd reason. "Ichigo. I do hope we meet again. The look in your eyes, one should not live a life of loneliness, not like how you do," the four-armed Titan stated, surprising Gaia. She decided not to question him on it though. From then Atlas and Gaia gained a new friend. XXXXXXX. Woo, the child muttered, amazed of the story, while her friends stared, as though they were in some trance. What happened to Ichigo? Another child asked in wonderment, a little disappointed that the story ended too soon for his liking. Ah, the old man said, as though he just remembered a fact that he had soon forgot. The old man was bald, while he did have large sideburns going down the sides of his face, and forming a large, gray beard. His attire were of white robes, which were a little dirty, and a gray sash, that rang from his right shoulder that split and went down to his left hip and left arm. He had a short, old-looking staff which rested on his left leg as he sat on some steps to the side of the road so he could tell his story to the children. Well, the two titans met with Ichigo while he was on his travels, but not much is known what they did from there. But one day, Ichigo just seemed to disappear. Some believe that he died, but I have my doubts, so I think he just went into hiding. You see, the other titans didn't look too fondly of him, and whenever one crossed paths with him, they would try to kill him. Ichigo didn't like the fact that he had to continue the senseless fighting, to continue hurting the giants, so he just hid. The children were still awestruck of such a being existing. Being able to defeat titans, single-handed no less. The gods themselves were hard-pressed to fight the titans, and sometimes had to at least double-team them to take them down. It was just incredible. You all should get going now. I think that your mothers are preparing your supper if the light is anything to go by, the old man stated, watching as the kids sped off onto the street, playing whatever games kids play. He sighed, youth, such a wonderful thing that he missed. He began walking down the street, soon blending into the crowds of people of the great city Athens. None realized the large, eagle-like bird, that was perched on the roof. It seemed to have listened to the entire story the elder had to tell. It quickly spread out its wings and took to the sky, moving at incredible speeds. As it flew, a thought ran through its mind, it can't be. What he said couldn't have been true. Just probably some fairy tale story. It dismissed the idea, but doubt was steadily creeping in. The winds picked up, blowing sand past several bodies that lay prone on the ground. The bodies themselves were truly monstrous, being something akin to a large shadows, each with its own shape and size, some humanoid, others unidentifiable. What was also strange were the holes that rested in their chests, where one could look straight through. But what was really unsettling were the strange, horrifying masks that rested upon their faces. These masks looked as though they were made of bone, of actual skulls. One of the bodies of these strange creatures, one that looked like a giant, twitched, the mouth of the mask slightly open, showing a second, smaller set of jaws, within its mouth. The creature took a deep intake of air, as though coming back to life. It was ragged, forced as the being's chest heaved. The eyes on the creature were a tainted yellow, as though its very stare was that of the devil's. It raised its head from the sand as it laid on its side. It looked down at its body, confusion on its face as it saw a large slash coming from its left shoulder down, along with a gash on its left arm. Dried blood surrounded the wounds and stained the sand. It looked around its surroundings, seeing the vast desert of its home, something in the distance that looked like dried up, white trees, which were illuminated with an unearthly glow with the ever-present crescent moon. The creature then looked to its side, seeing the bodies of the other, strange creatures, its brothers. The creature's yellow eyes lit up with fear as it came to some sudden realization. As a memory flashed before its eyes, its breathing began to pick up as it panicked. It looked around, trying to find something in the vast desert. As it saw nothing, it did not calm. It rose its right arm, extended it out, and dug it into the sand as it began to drag itself along the ground, stomach down. It strained to raise its other arm, the shoulder being sore and a slight numbness settled in. It found purchase, and dragged itself along, the sand easily giving as it left a trail of blood. Must get. The creature mustered out as it rose its now shaking left arm, hovering over the sand. The creature stopped. Its hand fell onto the ground, a little dust kicking up from the fall, as the being's head was suddenly stabbed with a large sword. The sword itself looked as though it was just a slab of metal forged to a black blade, the edge curving inward as it got to the tip, with a piece sticking out at the base with a white, tattered cloth, which was stained tan with dirt and sand, was wrapped around it in a makeshift handle. The cloth around the handle extended out to form a longer cloth that was slightly swayed in the wind. The blade was held onto by a being, around 6 feet in height, which wore a gray cloak, which rose up to cover half of his face, with a wide-brimmed, cone-shaped, straw hat which covered the rest of his face. The cloak had 2 sets of rope that tied around the neck of the cloak, keeping it together, which meet at a 6-sided badge with what looked like a flower design on it, and where the ropes dangled down to halfway down the cloak. The figure had its foot on the back of the creature, with an arm stuck out from the cloak to hold on to the sword, parting its cloak, revealing black garbs, tattered and worn from age, which seemed to be loose-fitting of the figure. It roughly removed the sword from the head of the creature, placing it on his shoulder, and turned around. As the figure started to walk away, the bodies of the other creatures began to fade and turn to dust, rising into the air, and seemingly broke down till there was nothing left to see. The figure was walking to 2 others in the distance, huddled together. They were far too small to be like the other creatures. As the figure began to get closer, he could clearly see that they seemed to be children. One of them looked over at him, and to the figure's gaze, stiffened. As the young boy looked up, he saw what he would have to be the most terrifying sight ever. Walking towards them was a being in a large cloak that seemed to be dragging across the ground, with a strange hat. It held a large blade over its shoulder, something that he thought only a minotaur could carry, with the ash of the monsters that were chasing them rise behind him, giving some sort of ominous look. The being, to him, looked far more menacing than anything that he could have ever imagined. He turned and hugged his little sister tighter, hoping that the monster that was walking towards them would just disappear. They were spent, too tired from the chase the creatures gave him and his sister. He heard the shuffling of sand as it came closer. Now he knew they weren't going to live, but he thought that at least their death would be quick. He and his sister had somehow stayed together after their deaths and throughout all of Hades. He was sure that they would be able to stick together, and nothing could possibly get worse. He heard the figure stop, maybe a few feet away. He waited for pain, and trying to keep his sister from seeing their fate. She was crying. But what came was not what he was expecting. He felt a hand land on his head, and gently ruffle his hair. He didn't understand. Wasn't the thing going to hurt them? He reluctantly turned his head to his shoulder, looking for the figure from the corner of his eye. The figure was crouched down, still on his feet with both his knees bent. Its sword lay down by his side, with his right arm resting on his knee. The figure raised its hand to its hat, and grabbed the tip. The young boy flinched, anticipating the face of some undead monster. What he saw instead shocked him. The figure lifted his hat, and pushed it to its middle back. Below showed a man with bright orange hair, which was a little long, which spiked downward, with it going down to the lower part of his neck. He had a pair of brown eyes, which seemed to be half-lidded. His hair seemed to go down to his eyes, and a few of the spikes seemed to hover in front of his vision. With the same hand he used to remove his hat, he rose it to the neck of his cloak, and lowered it, allowing him to see the rest of the man's face, which was well structured and firm. The man wasn't even really a man, but seemed to still be a teenager, maybe around something like 18 or even 20. He also saw a string around his neck, which he presumed to be attached to the hat. He saw that the man had on a small, warm smile as he looked down to him. "You did good, kid," the man said, his voice being a little scratchy. The boy looked on in wonderment to the man, and on, why one thought could go through his mind at the moment, and had to find out, "Who are you?" The man chuckled, keeping his warm smile, greatly releasing the tension that the boy had. "My name's Ichigo," he replied to the simple question. The boy now had his face scrunched with a look of disbelief. "Ichigo? What type of name is that?" the boy thought. He was about to voice his question when Ichigo looked past him with a now saddened look on his face. "Hey, don't cry, I'm not here to hurt you," Ichigo said in a small voice, which was to the boy's little sister who was still crying. Ichigo reached over and put a gentle hand on her arm as she cried into her brother's chest. After a minute, she started to get a little bit of control, and decided to took up. Her face was tear-stained and her eyes bloodshot. She looked to Ichigo, who couldn't tell what she thought of him at the moment. All she did was stare at him, with water still brimming in her eyes. "You promise?" Ichigo was confused at that. Her voice was soft but shaky. He had no problem voicing his thoughts. "Huh?" The little girl sobbed, while wiping her eyes with her arm, getting rid of the stains and some of the tears. Her brother looked at her a little confused as well, wondering what she meant. She looked sternly at Ichigo with solid eyes. "Do you promise that you won't hurt us?" was her statement. Ichigo's head tilted to the side at that, with a slight miffed expression on his face. He then straightened his head and smiled again, and with a nod of his head said, "Of course I promise. In fact, I'm here to take you two to a better place, one where you two will be safe, and maybe even find your parents." The boy was somewhat shocked at that, wondering what he meant. The girl on the other hand, began to sob again, and rushed to Ichigo, and jump up to hug onto his chest, while at the same time, caused Ichigo to fall back into a sitting position. The girl began to cry into his chest, but this time, she seemed to be muttering something. The only thing that Ichigo was able to catch was "thank you." He simply smiled warmly at the girl, and put his left hand on top of her head, gently rubbing back and forth, while he kept himself propped up with his right. The boy muttered out, catching his attention, "I just wanted to say thank you very much for saving our lives from those monsters. We owe you our lives." The boy was able to get out, giving Ichigo a determined look towards the end. "My name is Adonis, and my little sister's name is Agalia." The boy introduced themselves. Ichigo noticed that the boy seemed to be something of 7 or 8, with short brown hair, same as his sister, and black eyes. Agalia's hair was longer, reaching the middle of her back, and had brown eyes. Ichigo now knew why she seemed so innocent. She looked like she was 5. Ichigo frowned to himself. Why were children this young dead in the first place? Must be another Kami-forsaken war, he thought bitterly to himself. Ichigo was broken from his thoughts when Adonis began talking again. "We are forever in your debt, and I hope that we can." He was cut off as Ichigo raised his hand as a sign to make the boy stop. "It's okay, you don't have to do anything. I still have to get you and everyone else back to Sarai," Ichigo stated, as he looked down at Agalia. "I need to get up so I can get you and your brother out of here," he said with a soft voice, gently rubbing her head as she looked up to him and nodded. "Sarai, what is that?" Adonis asked as Ichigo walked over to his sword after his sister got off of him. Ichigo placed the blade on his shoulder, and walked to the two children. Adonis's eyes widened as Ichigo walked towards them, and thought the worst to come. He ran between his sister and Ichigo and turned to her. "Agalia, run!" he yelled. She was confused. Ichigo was going to hurt them? But he made a promise that he wouldn't. She was conflicted. She stayed rooted to the ground. That's when she saw them. Butterflies. Black butterflies, some of the most beautiful kind that she ever saw. They were descending high from the sky, and seemed to be fly around Ichigo. One of them strayed from the others and flew towards her. As it grew closer to her, she rose her hand, fingers extended, and allowed it to land on it. She looked towards the butterfly with wonder, completely mesmerized, until she saw her brother. Adonis was looking at his sister, wondering what she was doing playing with the odd butterfly. That is until he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned around, and saw Ichigo crouching down in front of him, sword still resting on his shoulder. Adonis was terrified, wonder what the man before him would do. "I'm not gonna hurt you, I promised I wouldn't. I'm just gonna send you with the others to your new home, a place where you can be safe and happy," Ichigo said with a soft voice, almost apologetic for scaring the boy. Ichigo then pointed the base of the hilt to the boy, confusing him. Then it began to glow blue, and Ichigo moved it towards the boy's forehead. Adonis couldn't even move, too mesmerized by the glow, as it touched his forehead. As Ichigo moved the sword away, there appeared a blue symbol on the boy's head. The boy just stood there with a shocked face, until a soft smile came to his face, and looked to Ichigo, muttering only 2 words as he began to glow a bluish color. "Thank you." As Adonis said this, Ichigo returned his own smile. As the boy began to glow so bright, he couldn't see the boy anymore, but he knew what was happening. After the glow dissipated, all that was left was a black butterfly. He stood up and walked over to the now amazed Agalia, with the new butterfly now following him. He crouched down in front of her. The butterfly that was with her had flown off. The one that her brother had become flew towards her and hovered in front of her face. It stayed there, for a minute, before moving for Ichigo to repeat the process. Now with Agalia held butterfly, there was one last task to do. He took his sword, and brought it forward, before putting into the space in front of him, the sword partially disappearing, into space. He then turned the sword to the right, seemingly unlocking a door. Then appeared a pair of Fusuma Japanese sliding doors, which slid open. Ichigo didn't move as the hell butterflies began to move through the portal. They could take care of themselves from here. After all was said and done, the portal disappeared. Ichigo then sighed. "Well, I think that's the last of them," he said, as he brushed his hand through his hair, and took his conical hat and put it back over his head. The bandages that swung from his sword began to wrap themselves around the blade, before he put it on his back. As he began to walk away, Ichigo stopped to turn around, looking at the space where the portal to the Tsuruite was. If one could see under his hat and cloak, they would see that he had a sad expression on his face. "Hope those kids will do alright. Sad that I won't be able to see them again. At least they'll be safe," he said to himself. He turned around and continued walking, biding for time to think of what to do next. After looking for the souls that had appeared here from Hades, it's been a constant job of trying to find and save the souls from the hollows. He only hoped that the others were able to seal up the rifts that were allowing the souls to cross over. It was funny. The keepers of the balance of death, the most powerful of the Shinigami, reduced to only a few survivors, stragglers left with nothing. They all just parted ways, letting the world take its course after the world devastation occurred. They allowed the Tsuruite to become an occupational area for only the past souls, as they deserved their final rests. They didn't need soldiers that will never fight an enemy. And with that thought, Ichigo decided to go back to the world of the living, and maybe see one of the beings that he befriended there. He knew he was gone for a few thousand years. He was asleep for quite some time, and this mission definitely took a few hundred. He wondered what has changed during his absence. Hera leaned against a large marble pillar, her left leg crossing over her right. She held a goblet within her right hand, with her left arm wrapped over her stomach, gripping her waist. She wore a small smirk as she watched her husband pace back and forth, hands held behind his back as he looked at the floor in deep thought. She enjoyed it whenever her husband was in distress. It was good to see him suffer. She brought her drink to her lips, taking a short sip of the heavenly wine, before she pushed off the pillar with her shoulder, and began to walk over to Zeus with a slow sway of her hips, her blue and white dress forming waves to the movement. "My, what has the great Zeus in such a worrisome state, I wonder?" she asked in a taunting voice. She was going to enjoy this moment for all it's worth. Zeus just seemed to ignore her, after giving no response whatsoever. Hera was a little irked at this. He has been pacing in front of his throne since last evening, acting so paranoid of something, his hair becoming ragged as a sign of his distress. Hera was about to try and get his attention again before she heard him mumble something. "The stories, they can't be true." She stared at Zeus in disbelief for a moment, shocked at what he said, before she let out a harsh laugh. The laugh caught Zeus' attention as he looked up to her, his clouded eyes shining in electric blue. His face formed to anger as he looked to Hera, who was still laughing. The stories? Zeus, don't tell me that you're still worried by those myths of this great warrior?" she asked as she got control of herself. Zeus' face went red as he heard her accusation. He knew that he looked foolish for the way that he'd been acting, and if the others knew if it were over stories, he didn't even want to know how much respect he would lose. If only they knew. He turned away from her, walking over to his throne. "You understand nothing, Hera. I've heard of these stories for generations among the mortals, and none of them have been passed on by a single one, all starting from their own origins. Zeus paused as he reached his throne, resting his hand on the armrest, while placing the other over his face. If only you knew all the facts, Hera, he finished solemnly. Hera scoffed at his reply, thinking of the great king of the gods have become nothing but a shell of his former self. All I need to know is that you have become so weak that you now fear the stories of mortals. She stated with another, more viscous, smirk upon her features. I wonder why you became so enticed with this story when you first heard it from that old wandering mortal. Is it that you even fear a mere fairy tale of a being stronger than you? She asked, never letting up a moment to rub this in Zeus' face. It was not the old mortal that I had heard of the story first, Hera, Zeus stated simply, his voice rough, making Hera tilt her head slightly and letting up her smirk slightly, but still present. Oh, then who, may I ask, did you hear this from first? She asked, now curious. Kronos. Hera looked on in slight shock, not being able to speak as Zeus continued, it was when I finished with his punishment. He gave me a warning before I left him. Hera looked on in wonderment, wanting to hear what the Titan could have said. He told me to look on in care of a being of such great power, one that even they feared. He told me stories of a being that held a cloak, a straw hat, and a great sword wrapped in bandages on his back. He told me that every Titan searched for him and tried to kill him, but to no avail. Even Kronos fought him, but was beaten down without much effort of this being. He only gave his name to two of them, Gaia and Atlas. His name was Ichigo. That is why I fear these stories. I thought that he was trying to frighten me, but instead, was warning me. Zeus finished, looking to Hera with a sad face. The fact that the mortals have been telling the same stories as his were too much of a coincidence. I simply couldn't just let this fly, and began to look into it. Too many know of this myth for me to stay calm. Hera looked on with a slightly paled face. What will you do? There's no way that you could confirm any of this. It has to be some superstition. Hera tried to deny, hoping for a way to disprove of any of this. She had heard many of the stories, but with there actually being a chance that it could be real, it scared her. Zeus looked on in space, ordering his thoughts, before sighing, coming to a decision. There is only one way to be sure. The marry. Hera looked on skeptically, amazed that he would go as far as that. I must go at once. This is a matter that cannot wait. He left no room for argument, as he walked hurriedly to the balcony. Hera watched as he went, before looking to her drink, swishing the red liquid around. I need a drink, she stated flatly as she turned and left the chamber. XXXXXXXXXXXXXX. Zeus walked onto the platform which beheld the three sisters. Clotho stayed in the center, unable to move from her throne. To any mortal, she would be considered a monstrosity, being a creature of incredible size, but also completely horrid, having several arms, and her form being so large that her skin became deformed, overlapping and forming folds, littered with warts. To her right stood Lachesis, the sister that held beauty befit for a god, and the sisters chose an emissary to represent them. She stood proud with her long silver hair, and tan body, wearing a small set of white robes. Along her back was her armor, akin to that of an eagle's wings. To the left is the eldest sister, at her paws. Long white hair which ended in long, crude blades, along with the same ones on her fingers, wearing a golden armor. Zeus knelt before them, bowing his head, not wanting to look them into their eyes. None were stronger than the sisters of fate, not even him. What have you come to us for? Zeus, Lachesis asked in her calm voice. They have been expecting him for some time now. I have come to find out if the stories of a being of great power were true or not. The sisters all looked on in amusement at this. The great god Zeus coming to them for the confirmation of a myth. You should know better than to come to us for such trivial things, Zeus. We are not to be used as playthings for you gods. Atropos hissed out, irked at this being thinking that could fool with them. I assure you, this is serious. I have been hearing stories of a great being after I had heard its first telling from Kronos. A being so powerful that he could even defeat you three. Zeus said in an urgent voice. He never noticed the sisters' shocked faces as Lachesis backed away. Which of these myths are you talking about? What was the name of this being that you fear so much? Bellowed Clotho in a hastened manner, her voice a little shaken. Zeus noticed her reaction, and felt a weight fall on his stomach. I was told that the being's name was, he paused for a moment, Ichigo. The sisters stayed quiet for some time, the looks of dread on their faces telling Zeus all he needed to know. What is it you wish to know? Lachesis asked, being the only one to answer, as Atropos flew off before Zeus could see any reaction, and Clotho refused to speak. Zeus stayed quiet for a moment before coming up with a suitable question. Will I have to worry about him coming to attack Olympus? No, you have nothing to fear in that matter. That being will never attack without reason. He only strikes back, never strikes first. That is why if you ever confront him, never attack him. None have been able to come close to defeating him. She replied in a monotone voice. Then why do you fear him so? I can see it in you three when I said his name. Zeus inquired, still trying to gain as much information on this Ichigo. That would be because he nearly killed us all, she stated, shocking Zeus. We thought that he would try something, like try to take our powers, or attack us for fame. We were arrogant, too sure of our powers, that we could send a warning to him. At the time, he stayed in a large village during the Titan's reign. He seemed to become attached to the mortals there, that when he left, we attacked it to display our powers, to warn him what he would have to face if he ever went against us. We left no survivors to that village. She finished with a faraway look. Zeus listened on, believing it to be a good idea in a show of power of such high beings, but we never knew of his true power. We unleashed a being that could very well have ended all life as we knew it, and it was focused all on us. She started with a reminiscent look. XXXXXXXXXX will be used for any flashbacks. Atropos was thrown back into a wall, forming a crater from the impact, as she began to slide down to the floor, leaving a bloody smear. Lachesis slid on the floor in front of Clotho, who couldn't move her arms from the many slashes that littered them. Lachesis was in no better condition, having a large slash along her torso, nearly reaching her heart. She also had several stab wounds along her arms and stomach, making her lose too much blood, making it very difficult to move. She looked on in fear as she saw Ichigo. No, this monster, walking deathly slow towards them, wearing a tight, black, long-sleeved shirt, which parted at the stomach to reveal bandages wrapped around it, along with the bottom reaching down to its feet, like some kind of cape from the waist down, with black being on the outside, and a blood red on the inside. It also wore loose, black pants, which with some kind of straw sandal with white socks. On its face was a white skull-like mask, the teeth being one of the most prominent features, being huge and menacing, along with two red stripes running down the face, over the eye sockets, which held evil eyes, with the iris being yellow and the sclera being black. The right sleeve of the shirt was ripped off, to show a long black chain wrapped around the arm and meeting with a long, black, skinny, straight-edged sword, which had a guard that had a strange spiral. The monster looked only at her with eyes that were full of hate as it made its slow approach. She tried to move, knowing that she would die if didn't, but the energy just left her. She knew it wasn't from her wounds, but from the fear she felt right now. She felt completely helpless right now, that it killed her, that she could do nothing. The being stopped several steps from her. She waited on in terror of what it was gonna do. She looked down to the ground, not wanting to meet this fate. Crink. It was an odd sound, as if a piece of pottery formed a crack. She looked up to see the creature's mask sported a crack, which began to form out. Soon, the mask began to crumble, and piece by piece fell to the ground, shattering into nothing but dust. When she focused on the being's eyes, she saw that the eyes that held such great evil and anger, were now wavering, as if burdened with a great pain. As the mask continued to fall apart, the being fell to its knees, bowing its head as larger chunks began to fall. Please. Lachesis looked on in shock at the being who was in front of her. He leaned forward, bringing his hands in front of him to keep himself up. Please. This time, he said it louder, but his voice was shaking. cracking as he spoke. It was then that she noticed that, even with his hair shadowing his face, tears were falling down to the floor. She was shocked to see that this being was crying. "Please, bring them back," he pleaded, his hands forming into fists as his body began to shake. "They had nothing to do with this. Please, I promise that I won't go against you, to bother any of you, just please, bring them back." His voice was broken now, as he bowed his head till his forehead met with the ground, fists to the floor at his sides. "Please, I'm begging you. XXXXXXXXXX." He cried for them. A being greater than a god cried over the lives of mortals, she stated, with now a sad look on her face. "We did what he asked. He couldn't do it himself because he never had his thread to use, so he needed us to do it. What we learned was that we cannot alter any fate that is of Ichigo's or one that he had been involved in. He appears as a blank slate to the mirrors." Zeus looked on in wonderment, finding it hard to believe that a being could show such mercy and compassion. "I believe that you heard of the story of Ichigo fighting the 5 titans?" she asked, turning to face Zeus, only to see him nod, before turning back. "The thing that we learned was that he purposely revealed himself to the titans so he could stop the fight. There was a small village not too far from the conflict, and would have been destroyed if he hadn't stepped in." She paused. "He has a kind heart, but tries to hide it so others won't try to take advantage of it." Zeus stayed quiet for a couple minutes, digesting all the information that he had just received. He then thought of a very important subject. "If he reappears, what could be the fate of Olympus?" he asked with a little urgency. "We could not tell you. The fate of anything that has a crossing with Ichigo can never be told, until it happens. Since we cannot tell what Ichigo will do or react, we can never tell the fate of who he interacts with. It is why he became a wanderer, so that he wouldn't hinder our ability to read the fates." She then looked to Zeus and began again, "But what I can tell you is that you and Olympus will meet with Ichigo, for its fate is undecided." Zeus was downtrodden, not being able to fully grasp that he would have to meet with this being. That is, until he thought of something. "If the fates are undecided, then that means that I could very well turn him into an ally of Olympus." Lachesis looked at Zeus with a neutral look as she closed her eyes, as she slightly lowered her head. "Yes, you could, if you made friends with him," she began, before she looked to Zeus with a hardened stare. "But so you know, even though that we fear him greatly, we also hold the deepest respect for him. So be wary of what you do, Zeus, or you may have more than one enemy." She finished in a harsh voice, before turning away and walking off. "You have the information that you came for, you may go now," she said in a dismissive tone. Zeus turned and began on his way to leave the temple. He had to prepare for a legend's arrival. "Ugh," was the only sound that was made, other than the rattling of chains, and the ominous, thunder-like sounds that came from the crimson clouds below. "How long?" came the great giant's thoughts. He couldn't tell time, never could, not down here. For all he knew, he could have had that thought 2 days ago, or it could have been just a minute ago, and he could have it again in the next 10 seconds. Down here, there was nothing that he could do. Chained to the slab of earth that he was cursed to hold up for eternity, so he could never run away from this fate. It would always be held above his head, as a constant reminder for what the Titans have done. Or rather, what one of them had done. Much like his other brothers and sisters, scattered all throughout the world to fulfill their own punishments. So long. He began to think to himself again, the only thing that it felt would keep it occupied, from descending further into madness. Name. He began once more, "What was my name?" After all this time, the great being began to forget his name. He made it a habit to think or say his name as often as he could. To at least never forget who he was. Who he is. But as time went on, he grew sick of saying his name. He grew tired of having the words slip through his mouth, leaving a bad taste every time. Like a mortal would get sick of only eating one thing all the time, having the thing that brought them so much joy at one point, becoming bland, and later hated, to them. At. The being tried, the words at the tip of its tongue. At last he finally managed to draw out, letting the word roll out at the end, as though he was relieved. Erg. He grunted out in pain once more. He looked up to one of his forehands. He once again saw the dreadful sight of those viscous, rusted chains wrapping over his palm. He knew he should have gotten used to these things digging into his rock-like flesh, that the sight of blood dripping down should not have bothered him. But it did. The pain never seemed to cease. It would never dissipate, never waver. At one time, he was sure the pain got even worse, growing in power, and even spreading throughout his arm. A trick of the gods. He was sure of it. Even his legs burned. The fires of whatever hell he stood above ever searing off whatever flesh he could have had left after all these years. Ever present, ever haunting. As if his torment wasn't great enough. But there was nothing he could do about it. He knew that there was no possible way to break through his chains of torment. And even if he could, what would he do? Go against the gods? In the state he was in, there was no way he could possibly fight ever again. Could it have been any different? The Titan thought, if he was here. Could it have been different? He always had the thought. What would have happened if his friend hadn't disappeared? Would you have aided us? Or would you have left us be, to fall as we did? He truly wondered what he would have done. Only befriending two of the Titans, and the rest as enemies, he wouldn't be surprised if he would have just left them. He still worried for his friend though. He met with him one last time, telling him that he would be going somewhere for some business, as he called it. He said that he would be gone for a decade or two, but as time went on, decades turned to centuries. "Will you ever come back?" he began, hoping that his friend would start another war for their sakes. The anger he held for them, after all that had passed. The hatred burned his chest, his pride, more than the mist below. He wanted revenge. He wanted judgment, his judgment, to pass, for them to feel his wrath, and return his pain 100-fold. And he hated himself for it. After all that time with him, a little bit of his friend's ideals rubbed off onto him. He was, after all, just about the only being that he could respect. He knew his friend would be mad, no, furious at what they have done to them. But the humans depended on the gods. They were their strength, their hope, and their belief. His friend would never be able to bring himself to do unto them what they have to the Titans. And Atlas could never hold it against him. "Ichigo," he whispered out, shutting his eyes and tilting his head down, wishing to give him one final request, in memory of the Titans. That is when he saw it, a flash of blue. He tilted his head, not having the care to do much of anything else. The chains began to fall, unravel from his hand and arm. There was a phantom pain of what was left, pulsing. But that was all. There was no more sorrow for his well-being, no anger or depression. It was like he was free. After releasing a sigh, one that he felt like he was holding since the pain began to set in, he clenched his fist, and brought it down. The lack of support from that one arm quickly fell upon the others. But, he felt no extra strain on them, like he could hold it all up with one arm, and could lift more. He felt like his old self. Bringing the fist down to his face, and narrowed his eyes. He never had to strain them like this. Centuries of just looking within one focus has its effects. But, as a Titan, his eyes quickly began to adjust to the closeness and size of the object he held in his fingers. All he could really see was a tan-colored figure. He felt something was off. Not by instinct, but felt that there was something that was physically weird with the object in his hand. He squeezed, thinking that the action would give him a clue as to what felt so wrong. That's when his eyes widened, a slight shock overcame him. His hand tightened its grip, the fingers snaking around with the power to crush anything. Instead, his hand never tightened, the fingers not budging, and began to be opened by whatever he held within. He then felt the object disappear. He didn't even feel a move, just like it phased out of existence. But in that instant, a figure appeared on his finger. Just one quick glance, and he noticed the tattered cloak. Next was the conical hat above the figure's head. And finally, Atlas saw the giant of a sword wrapped in bandages. He knew who it was immediately. Atlas was filled with a few emotions at a time. But, since he was not braced himself to confront this figure once again, He went with the first thing that came to his mind. Bringing down his second hand, not caring about the trouble he now had with balancing the object above his head, and rammed his fist into the figure. The figure was a little stunned with the Titan was swinging a fist at him, and was sent flying, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. "Where the hell have you been?" was the only natural thing the Titan could say. He never knew that this was how he would greet his old friend, with a sucker punch made of blind fury. The figure then reappeared, some distance from the giant, and at eye level, standing on the air itself. "What the hell? I come here to get you out and this is how you thank me? Well, apparently, the feeling's mutual." "Of course it is," Atlas yelled back, sounding like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Well, it ain't exactly my fault. Turns out the problem was bigger than what we expected." Like hell anything could take that long. Atlas was still irked by the whole thing. Silence fell over the two beings, the human-sized figure not having anything to say afterwards. Atlas began to get his temper under control at this point, bringing his hands back to holding the slab of earth. He was beginning to go over what the figure had said. "You can't get me out," was all that the Titan could say. The figure tensed, Atlas guessed, and asked in as calm a voice he could muster, "What the hell are you talking about?" "You can't get me out, Ichigo. This is the punishment for the wrongs we Titans have committed. Let me have my pride and see this through, rather than be a coward and run from it." This was mostly truth to Atlas. After the chains were gone, it felt as though that what he was saying was the easiest thing ever, clearing his mind from anything negative. Yep, those damn chains were definitely a trick of the gods. To hell with pride. "I don't know what's happened while I was gone, but I am not leaving you down here," was Ichigo's reply, somewhat losing the edge in his voice. Atlas did not respond, merely looking down on the being with a determined look in his eyes. Atlas only focused on the area between the conical hat and the cloak, knowing exactly where the eyes were. They stayed in that standoff for several minutes, neither wavering. After a while Ichigo let out a sigh, a sign that he had bowed down. "Fine, I won't break you out. But at least tell me what happened with." He raised his arms to either side of him with a shrug, looking around, gesturing to everything. "Very well. You'll need this knowledge, as you're the only one who doesn't seem to know," Atlas said, Ichigo taking the last part as a jab of some sort. Kronos had several children with a human woman. She was said to have had pure blood, that which was considered perfection. As she had his children, his power passed on to them. This was the creation of the gods. They had powers, much like Out's own. But, before their birth, Kronos went to the Sisters of Fate. They told him that his own children will rise up against him. He started to become paranoid, and began to swallow them all, to be forever imprisoned within his stomach. But, the woman grew to hate Kronos more and more with every one of her children he consumed, so, for the last one, she replaced with a rock, and gave the child to an eagle. Eventually, the eagle found a suitable place for the god, and gave him to Gaia, who raised him to take revenge on Kronos. She admits to this day that what she did was a mistake. Zeus went out, and freed his brothers and sisters, and waged war against us. Some called the war the end of days. The gods won the battle, and sealed most of us in Tartarus, while the rest were given other punishments. They made themselves a castle, called Olympia, to house themselves. The one who rose up and started the war became the king of the gods. His name is Zeus. You must be careful. These gods are easily swayed with their emotions, and hold more pride than any titan, and will take the smallest insult with a vice. Ichigo stayed silent for a second before commenting, "Well, they're arrogant, I'll give them that. But I have one question." There was a pause. "How the hell did she survive?" Another pause. "Huh? How did she survive?" "Who?" "The woman who bared Kronos' children. How the hell did she survive?" "Survive what?" Atlas was confused, not really following where Ichigo was going with this. "You know. I've seen Kronos, and how could anything human survive anything remotely that size?" It took Atlas a few seconds to understand where Ichigo was going with this. "Oh, for the love of. Get your head out of the gutter and get the hell out of here. You need to figure out what you're going to do after this," And now you have an entirely new enemy after you. They know of your existence, and they will find you. They may not go after you themselves, but they'll send their army after you, and they will take down a city if they have to. Their wrath is beyond any of our comprehension, Atlas explained. Even after being the oldest being in existence, he still thought like a teenager. Ichigo took a mock step back and raised his arms up in defense. All right, calm down, just trying to lighten things up down here. Ichigo paused, before continuing, with a more serious tone of voice, thanks for the heads up, really appreciate it. Wish you would let me repay you. Atlas caught the hint, I'll be fine, I don't need you to set me free. Besides, what am I supposed to do after I get out? The gods aren't gonna have much trouble searching for me when they notice that I've escaped. Alright, your choice, Ichigo said, before turning, and began to walk at an angle towards the rock that Atlas was holding up. Before he left through a crack in the earth, what Atlas presumed to be the way Ichigo got in, stopped, and turned around. You sure you don't want out? You looked a little worn out there when I came in. Atlas grew a smirk. Ha! You doubting my strength, kid? As if this thing could even pose as a challenge for me. I ain't known as the strongest titan for nothing, Atlas bellowed out, shaking the earth a bit as it gloated. Ichigo grew a smirk. Guess so. Well, I'll see you later then. He turned around, and began to walk up the wall of the hole, before yelling out one last thing once he was out of sight. And I'll be sure to give those gods a little hell. Atlas couldn't help but to laugh at that. He laughed for a good 10 minutes before he got enough control to say anything. Yes, Ghost Hinigami. Show the gods true power. He tilted his head up, as though looking into the heavens themselves, before continuing, you hear that Zeus, the god of death, has returned. Poseidon, god of the sea, was an easily swayed man. He could never help himself when it came to beautiful women. Especially mortal women. He could never help himself with them, always led by their intense beauty, fair skin, and above all, their warmth. He could never understand why they always cried, or when they ran. He was a god. They should be thankful, to be honored to have a god be dazed by their beauty. He thought that they deserved it if it hurt. He currently had his sights on one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. Golden hair, the rarest of any kind, a gorgeous face, and what's more, a virgin. Yes, he would be sure to thank Athena for giving this woman to him. Who knew that Athena could become jealous of a mortal woman when it came to beauty? To him, it makes this girl even sweeter. Medusa, he said in a soft voice, a hint of lust within. Soon, you shall be mine. That's it. Goodbye.